So good evening to a very small but highly select group of visitors to Suffragists from the Stage, Part 2. In Part 1 we took a broader look at the larger picture of the suffrage movement, and we spotlighted 3 actresses who had been real powerhouses but totally forgotten now. And so for Part 2 our goal is that we're going to do a different one each year as we get up to 2020. And with the feedback that we got on tons and tons of research, this time around we've really expanded our look at African American women and what they were doing, working women, and we're really looking more broadly at the suffrage plays as a propaganda tool as opposed to spotlighting individual artists the way we did last time. So we think it's about 90 minutes. You're our test audience. There is no intermission. The bathroom's there. Turn your phones on silent if you would please. And I think that's all I have to say. Just enjoy, and we'll be choosing one when we're done.
As a Society for the Preservation of Theatrical History, we are mainly concerned with reclaiming the contributions of women who have played a substantial role in theater for over 200 years and who also had an extended influence on our civic and political life.
We have a story to tell.
On behalf of these great women from the past and the women of today who make their mark in business, science, math, and politics, in mothering, sistering, teaching, in the arts, and on the stage.
Nevertheless, she persisted.
Has become an important contemporary meme, but it could just as well serve as the motto for women activists of the 19th and early 20th centuries, especially those engaged with the struggle for equality at the ballot box. Not counting earlier efforts by individuals and small groups, it would take almost 75 years from the first organized Women's Rights Convention until the passage of the 19th Amendment, the very definition of
persistence.
Yes. Just days before her death in 1906, Susan B. Anthony gave that earlier movement its own watchword, eerily similar to today's meme.
Failure is impossible,
she said, after 70 years in the trenches, because of the hundreds of women who had consecrated their lives to the movement. Notably, women of the theater were among those hundreds and as integral to the crusade for women's rights and suffrage as they were to other reform efforts. Abolition of slavery,
fair labor practices, elimination of poverty,
access to health care,
birth control, and even
conservation and environmentalism.
Sound familiar?
of the recent women's marches in Washington, D.C. And then let us tell you about another march in that same city in 1913. Look at the number of actress activists who are mobilizing today and discover how many more were front and center more than 100 years ago. Recent assaults on civil liberties, the environment, and labor are straight out of the Gilded Age, and theater women were fighting those battles too. As we sit here before you, we too are proud
Women of the Stage.
Before introducing you to some extraordinary leading ladies upon whose shoulders we stand, let's first look at the suffrage movement in a broader context, beginning with two of the women who really got things started on a national level.
Elizabeth Cady Stanton, one of the most famous foremothers of the struggle for women's equality, composed the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments for the first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, New York, July 19th to 20th, 1848. Organizers feared that hardly anyone would attend the meeting. They were surprised when 300 people arrived, including men. Women let the men stay, but didn't allow them to speak until the second day. Although Stanton and Susan B. Anthony had corresponded, they actually met for the first time in person on a street in Seneca Falls in 1851, 3 years after the first convention. They became lifelong friends and partners for the fight for equal rights. Like many suffragists, they were also avid temperance activists because of laws that gave husbands complete control of the family and its finances, and the difficulty for women to divorce. If you had a drunk for a husband,
You were out of luck.
Anthony and Stanton were both abolitionists, founding the short-lived American Equal Rights Association in 1866 in a merger with the Anti-Slavery Society. AERA was dedicated to securing the ballot for all citizens, regardless of race, color, or sex, and members included men and women, both black and white. But the passage of the 15th Amendment, which ratified voting rights for African American men but not for women at all, led to a split with their colleagues. And Anthony and Stanton formed the National Woman Suffrage Association in 1869 to work specifically on achieving the vote for all women. Anthony and Stanton are the most remembered of the pioneering suffragists today, but they had many peers. Amelia Bloomer, who introduced the two, who was editor of The Lily, the first newspaper for women, which began as a temperance journal. Bloomer also promoted a change in dress standards to be less restrictive, known as the Bloomer suit, adapting a more rational costume, trousers gathered at the ankles, topped by a short dress or skirt and vest. When the costume was ridiculed and Bloomer received harassment from the street, she dropped the fashion. Frances Dana Barker Gage, reformer, feminist, and abolitionist, claimed that her suffrage activism began at the age of 10. She helped her father make barrels, and her work was so well executed that her father praised her, but then lamented her
Accident of gender.
This kindled a hatred for the limitations imposed on her as a female and led her to begin her suffrage journey for real in 1848. In 1851, she presided over a women's rights convention in Akron, Ohio, and she traveled the country lecturing on abolition, women's rights, and temperance, and penned the lyrics for a hymn, 100 years hence, in 1852, which predicted that
Oppression and war would be heard of no more, nor blood of a slave leave his print on our shore. Conventions will then be a useless expense, for we'll all go free suffrage 100 years hence.
she also believed
When we hold the ballot, we shall stand just there. Men will forget to tell us that politics are degrading. They will bow low and actually respect the women to whom they now talk platitudes and silly flatteries.
Dr. Anna Howard Shaw was a suffrage leader, a physician, and one of the first ordained female Methodist ministers in the United States. Preaching was her vocation. When she entered the Boston University School of Theology in 1876, she was the only woman in a class of 42 men. She suffered financial hardships, but managed to get her doctoral degree in 1886. She served as the president of the National American Association of Women's Suffrage from 1904 to 1915, and was regarded as the orator of the cause. Her speech on the fundamental principle of a republic is listed as number 27 in American Rhetoric's top 100 speeches of the 20th century. It says,
We women do not want the ballot in order that we may fight, but we do want the ballot in order that we may help men to keep from fighting, whether it is in the home or in the state. Just as the home is not without the man, so the state is not without the woman. And you can no more build up homes without men than you can build up the state without women. We are needed everywhere where human problems are to be solved.
other prominent suffragists working in the early in the movement included Lucretia Mott, Alice and Phoebe Carey, Lucy Stone, and Matilda Electa Jocelyn Gage.
Fun fact, Matilda Gage, like Stanton, was a strong advocate for the separation of church and state. They both believed that patriarchal Christianity and its orthodox view that women should be subservient to man had done much damage to their gender. So they wrote the Woman's Bible.
Although most of the leading suffragists were also staunch abolitionists, there was tension between these white, largely affluent women and their African American counterparts. In many of the most influential organizations and visible events, women of color consistently had to fight to be included as equals with their white peers. Indeed, that same tension is still evident today in that the women's movement is often not reflective of the specific needs and priorities of women of color.
Fun fact, that first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls was held in the same spot where the matriarchal Iroquois Confederacy met 300 years earlier. Harriet Converse, who spoke at the convention, offered her gratitude to the Iroquois who rendered to the mothers of their people the rights maternal, political, social, civil, religious, and of the land.
Native American women would actually not receive the vote until 1924, when the Indian Citizenship Act was passed. Even then, some states continued to bar any Native Americans from voting until 1957.
They were not the only women of color engaged in the struggle, but large numbers of African American women from notable freeborn families, as well as the formerly enslaved, were ardent suffragists. They contributed greatly to the struggle for universal suffrage. These highly accomplished women have been largely absent from the narrative for over a century. In recent years, they have regained some of the recognition due them, but sadly, in a way that seems to regard these women as unique.
They were not. Understandably, African Americans were among the most invested in the need for the franchise and equal rights for all. Even before the Civil War, free black women came together to create organizations dedicated to improving the status and welfare of their communities. They obviously fought against slavery, but also segregation,
Discrimination,
and the second-class nature of their citizenship. They fought for
Temperance,
education,
Job training,
and
moral behavior.
the legendary Sojourner Truth was born into slavery around 1797 in Ulster County, New York. She escaped with her infant daughter to freedom in 1826 and received official emancipation in 1827 when the state of New York ended slavery. In 1828, she discovered that her 5-year-old son had been illegally sold by her former owner to a plantation in Alabama. She took him to court and became the first black woman to win such a case against a white man. Her given name was Isabella Baumfree. Her first language was Dutch, but she took the name Sojourner Truth in 1843, telling her friends,
"The Spirit calls me and I must go,"
and left to make her way traveling and preaching about the abolition of slavery and women's rights. In 1851, she attended the Ohio Women's Rights Convention and delivered her famous extemporaneous speech, which has come down to us via a version written in 1863 by Frances Gage. Over the next 10 years, Truth spoke before dozens, perhaps hundreds of audiences. When the Civil War ended slavery, she was just as tireless in promoting the rights of women and particularly African American women. Speaking at the American Equal Rights Association in 1867, she urged her audience to
Keep things going while things are stirring.
as she feared that
Once the fight for colored rights settles down,
it would take a long time to warm people back up to the idea of colored women having equal rights.
well, children, where there's so much racket, there must be something out of kilter. I think that twixt the Negroes of the South and the women of the North, all talking about rights, the white men will be in a fix pretty soon. But what's all this here talking about? Well, that man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. And ain't I a woman? Look at me. Ooh, look at my arm. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it, and bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? I have borne 13 children, and seen them most all sold off to slavery. And when I cried out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman? Then they talk about this thing in their head. What's that they call it? Intellect. Oh, that's it, honey. What's that got to do with women's rights and Negroes' rights? If my cup won't hold but a pint and yours holds a quart, wouldn't you be mean not to let me have my little half measure full? Then, that little man in black there says, women can't have as much rights as men because Christ wasn't a woman. Where did your Christ come from? Where did your Christ come from? From God and a woman. Man had nothing to do with him. If the first woman God ever made was strong enough to turn the world upside down all alone, these women together ought to be able to turn it back and get it right side up again. And now they is asking to do it. The men better let them. Oh, obliged to you for hearing me, and now old Sojourner ain't got nothing more to say.
Although we all know about Harriet Tubman's extraordinary work on the Underground Railroad, and many know about her service as a spy for the Union Army, she was also an active suffragist. Tubman was a friend to Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, and she toured New York, Boston, and Washington, speaking about her experiences as a female slave to champion the suffrage cause.
Fun fact, Tubman is commemorated together with Stanton, Bloomer, and Sojourner Truth in the calendar of saints of the Episcopal Church.
The Fortons were one of the most prominent black families in Philadelphia, founding and financing multiple anti-slavery organizations and serving as a stop on the Underground Railroad. Mother, Charlotte Van Deen Forton, and her daughters, Margaretta, Harriet, and Sarah, were also actively involved in the suffrage movement from the mid-19th century on. According to William Lloyd Garrison, they
have few superiors in refinement, in moral worth, in all that makes the human character worthy of admiration and praise.
Harriet was a friend of Susan B. Anthony and Lucretia Mott, and a member of the National Women's Suffrage Association. She and her sister, Margaretta, were key organizers of the 5th National Women's Rights Convention in Philadelphia in 1854. Harriet's daughter, Hattie, became the first African-American vice president of the association. Her daughter, the daughter of former slaves who became wealthy after the Civil War, Mary Church Terrell, was a highly influential leader in the suffrage and civil rights movements. She was one of the first black women to receive a college degree. She then earned a graduate degree from Oberlin College, her alma mater, and was awarded 3 honorary doctorates. Terrell was a noted national and international activist and speaker for civil rights and suffrage, and a prolific writer on social issues. She founded the Colored Women's League in 1892, which became the National Federation of Colored Women in 1896. Terrell was a founding member of the NAACP in 1909 and remained on the front lines into her 80s, picketing against the segregation of restaurants and theaters. For all that she accomplished, she still felt the weight of the barriers against her.
I cannot help wondering sometimes what I might have become and might have done if I had lived in a country which had not had circumscribed me on account of my race, that had allowed me to reach any height I was able to attain.
Mary Ann Shad Carey worked as a journalist, publisher, teacher, and lawyer. Born free in Wilmington, Delaware in 1823, her family fled to Canada after passage of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850, which threatened all blacks regardless of their legal status. In 1853, she founded the Provincial Freeman and became the first black female publisher in North America. Carey returned to the U.S. after her husband died in 1869, teaching in Washington, D.C. public schools. She became the
First female student
at the newly established Howard University Law School, but had to wait a decade to receive her law degree because D.C. laws prohibited women from joining the bar. She spoke at the 1878 convention of the National Woman Suffrage Association, calling for an amendment to strike the word
Male
from the U.S. Constitution. In 1876, Carey requested that the names of 94 black women be recognized as signers of the Women's Declaration of Sentiments. Her request was
denied.
In 1880, she organized the Colored Women's Progressive Franchise Association and joined the National Woman Suffrage Association herself, working alongside Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and testifying before the Judiciary Committee of the House of Representatives.
Fun fact, Shad Carey's former residence in D.C. was declared a National Historic Landmark in 1976. In 1987, she was designated a Women's History Month honoree by the National Women's History Project.
Ida B. Wells, also the daughter of former slaves, was a major leader in both the civil rights and suffrage movements. Among a long list of accomplishments, she was an investigative journalist, newspaper editor, sociologist, and political campaigner. She founded or co-founded the most influential black women's organizations and newspapers in the late 19th century. She gained national and international attention in the 1890s for her crusade against lynching. Writing about her speaking tour in England, she became the first African-American woman to be paid as a correspondent for a mainstream white newspaper, the Daily Inter-Ocean in Chicago. As a journalist, she believed
The way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them.
and virtue knows no color line. Fannie Barrier Williams was an educator and women's rights activist and the director of the Art and Music Department of the Prudence Crandall Study Club, an organization formed by Chicago's elite African-American community. Williams and her husband were close associates of Ida Wells and her husband, Ferdinand Barnett. Among many accomplishments, she succeeded in gaining representation for blacks at the Chicago World's Fair Columbian Exposition of 1893 and personally addressed the first World's Congress of Representative Women. She destroyed the notion that slavery had left African American women incapable of the same moral and intellectual levels as other women. A few of the many other African American suffragists include poet Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, who said,
No race can afford to neglect the enlightenment of its mothers.
journalist and activist Gertrude Bastille-Mossel, who denounced the myth that women fighting for the vote would remain unmarried, and wrote,
Give women more power in the government offices if the desire is for peace and prosperity.
and Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, about whom we will hear much more later.
The 1890s also welcomed the new woman, active in the cause of suffrage, working outside of the home, no longer the traditional wife mother, but equal with men. The women of the theater were exemplars of the new woman. They were self-supporting, with several playwrights and actresses achieving millionaire status, or today's equivalent, by the early 20th century. They were avatars of a new sexual freedom and challenged all kinds of gender norms. And they were not afraid to use their fame and fortune, along with their theatrical skills, to take on the most entrenched and powerful interests of the time. There were no better stump or storefront speeches than those given by women who had studied elocution and could project from the stage to an audience of 1,500 people. They were masters at staging rallies and parades, using the art of spectacle to pack an emotional as well as rhetorical punch. And they created a highly effective propaganda machine in the writing and production of hundreds of suffrage plays.
Often members of multiple clubs and political unions, theater women also gathered in their own groups as a way to support each other in their work and personal lives. Even in clubs open to women of all professions, women of the theater were a large and visible cohort of the membership. Cirrhosis was an organization of professional and literary women founded in New York City in 1868 by pioneering journalist Jane C. Crowley, who began her career in 1854. Her column, Parlor and Sidewalk Gossip, was so popular that by 1857, she became one of the first women syndicated columnists, appearing in newspapers in New Orleans, Richmond, Baltimore, and Louisville. After her husband's death in 1889, Crowley took a position as professor of journalism and literature at Rutgers University, becoming the first American woman to teach news writing. Crowley and other women writers had been denied tickets to a New York Press Club event honoring Charles Dickens. The presenters claimed that the presence of the women would make the occasion promiscuous. Offended, the female journalists founded their own club, naming it Cirrhosis. Their kickoff meeting was at Delmonico's, site of the Dickens event. Women at the time were not allowed in fine dining establishments, unchaperoned by men. But when Crowley showed up with her gang, they were forced to let them in. Delmonico's hosted each anniversary meeting after that. The word cirrhosis has been thought to come from a Greek word meaning sister, but it is the botanical name of a class of plants with a collection of flowers which mature into fruits, like the pineapple, all joined together in one wholesome body.
This name seemed exactly the thing. It was new, it had a pleasant sound, and was, as Mrs. Crowley said, full of gracious meaning.
The term symbolized these women's determination to transform supposedly delicate and feeble ladies into important members of society. Unlike other women's clubs at the time, Cirrhosis had neither a charitable nor socioeconomic purpose, but sought
Collective elevation and advancement.
They also preferred not to engage in aggressive topics like women's suffrage. Politics and religious discussions were taboo. Harper's Weekly chose to lampoon the club as a radical effort to switch gender roles in society. When men started applying to the club, they received this response.
We willingly admit, of course, that the accident of your sex is on your part a misfortune and not a fault, nor do we wish to arrogate anything to ourselves, because we have the good fortune to be born women. Cirrhosis is too young for the society of gentlemen and must be allowed time to grow. By and by, when it has reached a proper age, say 21, it may ally itself with the press club or some other male organization of good character and standing. But for years to come, its reply to all male suitors must be principles, not men.
The New England Women's Club was created in Boston that same year by Julia Ward Howe and Harriet Hanson Robinson, founder of the National Women's Suffrage Association in Massachusetts. Although the club was run by and for women, men were allowed to join, and Ralph Waldo Emerson was a member. Unlike many of her peers in the suffrage movement, Harriet Robinson had been a mill worker in Lowell, Massachusetts in her childhood and youth. She took full advantage of the Lowell system, which provided educational and cultural opportunities for female factory workers to eventually become an author and poet. Julia Ward Howe would also found the New England Women's Suffrage Association in 1868, and many other clubs throughout her life.
A fun fact, Julia Ward Howe wrote the Battle Hymn of the Republic, and in 1908 was the first woman to be elected to the American Academy of Arts and Letters.
In celebration of Cirrhosis' 21st anniversary, in 1889, Jane Crowley invited Howe and members of women's clubs throughout the United States to attend a convention in New York City. On April 24, 1890, 63 organizations officially formed the General Federation of Women's Clubs. By 1915, there were 2,000 clubs as members. They established and reinforced the idea that women had a moral duty and responsibility to transform, define, and shape public policy.
They did not endorse suffrage until 1914.
Fun fact, The General Federation of Women's Clubs still exists today and has 80,000 members internationally.
The 12th Night Club was founded in 1889 by leading lady Alice Fisher as a social club for actresses to retaliate against the all-male Players and Lambs clubs. Initially organized as the FAD Club, Fencing, Athletics, and Dancing, it was a way for aspiring actresses to get better training by pooling their funds to pay for teachers. As membership expanded, it became the 12th Night Club in 1891, with 12th Night the date of their annual gala. Men were allowed to join them. Within a year, the club had 100 members and would go on to mount impressive benefits for actresses in need, including a major one for actress Clara Morris.
Fun fact, Edwin Booth was one of the early supporters of the club, and he paid $100 for a ticket to the first club benefit ever given. Alice Fisher long kept what was considered to be his last letter, sending his regrets that he could not attend the 1893 12th Night celebration.
While the 12th Night Club was primarily a social group and is celebrating its 127th anniversary this year, the Professional Women's League was in the mold of intellectual, social, and self-help organizations, pioneered by Cirrhosis and the New England Women's Club. Founded in 1893, its objectives were to provide women, mostly actresses, with a network of supportive social contacts, opportunities to enhance their organizational and leadership skills, and be a place where they could discuss political and social issues like
Feminism.
The first installation of officers was organized by Mrs. A.M. Palmer, wife of the famed producer and theater owner Albert Marshall Palmer. Jenny June Crowley was a vice president, and the executive committee included Minnie Mattern Fisk and Mary Shaw. The New York Times reported that in just a few months, the membership was 400 strong and still growing. The great aim of the league, according to Mrs. Palmer, was
to aid every member in her struggle to reach the highest ideal of her chosen profession by arming her with better weapons for her warfare and by equipping her with better armor for the hard fight to be encountered by every woman toiler.
Harriet Stanton Blatch, daughter of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, had been radicalized by the militant suffragettes during her 20 years in England, and she was impatient with the leading American organizations.
The only method suggested for furthering the cause was the slow process of education. We were told to organize, 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 to the end of educating public opinion.
She had returned to the U.S. in 1902, and the next year became involved with the newly formed Women's Trade Union League. Combining her interest in labor rights with the need for a more activist suffrage movement, she created the Equality League of Self-Supporting Women in 1907. Under her leadership, the League enrolled 20,000 factory, laundry, and garment workers from the Lower East Side, working women who had never before been sought out by suffrage organizations. In 1910, the name was changed to the Women's Political Union, which had branches nationwide, and would merge with Alice Paul's National Women's Party in 1916. After suffrage was achieved, Blatch proclaimed,
Perhaps someday man will raise a tablet reading in letters of gold. All honor to women, the first disenfranchised class in history who, unaided by any political party, won enfranchisement by its own effort and achieved the victory without the shedding of a drop of human blood. All honor to the women of the world!
Founded by American Broadway actress Gertrude Elliott in London in 1908, the Actresses Franchise League was active in both London and New York. Women working in any area of the theater were welcome to join. The League printed and distributed pamphlets held meetings to educate women on suffrage, and produced propaganda plays with associated performing groups touring popular pieces.
In 1909, the Billboard magazine carried the headline, "Women of the stage all desire to vote." It may be a passing fad, but women's suffrage is just now the subject of general discussion among the people of the stage. Some of them have really become worked up about it, to such an extent that at teas and after theatrical performances, it is the sole topic of conversation.
Mary Shaw, Broadway leading lady and suffrage activist, had been a member of the first executive committee of the Professional Women's League. She believed passionately in the proposition that women and men are equal.
To me, there is always a sustaining thought, the equality of women's value as compared with man's. We women must develop ourselves and must not allow our habits of thought, our inheritance, to retard our best expression. We must search for things within ourselves, not in our environment, and we must not drug ourselves with formulas and compromises.
With support from actresses in the League, Shaw launched a campaign in 1913 to become its president. She lost by 3 votes in a bitterly contested election. The celebrated singer and actress Lillian Russell, known as the American Beauty, one of her main supporters, had been elected the club's vice president that year, but refused to serve and vowed never to set foot in the club again. Decrying the PWL as a place for
Rich women with fat pocketbooks,
Shaw launched the Gamut Club in less than a month as an
aristocracy of brains,
modeled on and named for a men's club that had once made her an honorary member. At its peak, the Gamut would boast over 250 members and include the brightest names in theater, prompting one source to boast,
The membership roll looked like the program of an all-star entertainment for the benefit of the Actors Fund.
in addition to Shaw and Russell, other luminaries included Ethel Barrymore and Olive Logan, who in her autobiography, Behind the Footlights, wrote,
a woman should be able to feel when she lies down at night that she is really thanking her maker and not her husband for having been given this day her daily bread.
The Gamut also produced numerous plays, both publicly and privately. And women worked in all areas of production that were denied to them in commercial theater: writing, directing, technical, and management. From their first series on Sunday night performances, the Morning Telegraph announced,
The Gamuteers of the Gamut Club insist on running down the whole scene of theatrical activities. Now they have become producers.
A year earlier, in 1912, Marie Jenny Howe had founded a more radical feminist group in Greenwich Village, Heterodoxy. Howe specified only one membership requirement, that an applicant not be orthodox in her opinion. Howe was a noted feminist, labor organizer, Unitarian minister, and writer. She was a leader in the National Women's Party and formed the New York State Suffrage League. Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright Zona Gale was also an active member of the National Women's Party. These clubs provided a safe space for the new woman to gather, draw strength from each other, and put forth their ideas and beliefs into the public sphere. Their accomplishments are impressive, but the achievements of women in the African American club movement is stunning. They mobilized partly because white women's clubs, with the exception of those in New England,
Did not allow
black women to be members, but also because these women of color had different priorities for their organizations.
Most African Americans were Republicans, the party of Lincoln, until the New Deal, when the traditional roles of America's 2 parties were reversed, and Democrats became associated with civil rights and social justice.
Free black women came together in associations soon after the American Revolution. By 1830, Philadelphia alone had 27 female mutual aid societies. The Female Benevolent Society of St. Thomas led the way in 1793. The Daughters of Africa formed in 1821 with 200 working class women who
bought groceries and supplies for the needy, paid sick benefits, and lent money to society members in emergency situations.
The African Union Society was founded in 1780 in Newport, Rhode Island. Women could not be officers or vote, so they founded a counterpart, the African Female Benevolent Society, in 1809. Members of the Colored Female Religious and Moral Society of Salem, Massachusetts, from its inception in 1818, promised, among other things,
To be charitably watchful over each other.
With the ratification of the 13th Amendment in 1865, Black women increased their organizing and often worked with churches to ensure their communities were taken care of. The Ladies' Benevolent Society of Detroit was created in 1867 to provide sick and death benefits to its members. 20 years later, in the same city, the Willing Workers Society made and sold quilts, using the proceeds to provide a range of assistance to Detroit's poor Black children and families. Technically, beneficial societies function primarily for the advantage of their members, and benevolent societies worked to provide for the needy. However, very few African American women associations function exclusively as only one or the other. The Women's Auxiliary of the National Baptist Convention was founded in 1900, and at one point was the largest group of African American women in the United States.
By 1900, almost every Black community had a women's club. By 1910, in proportion to population size, African American women outpaced white women in the number of clubs created. By 1914, the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs had 50,000 members and over 1,000 clubs participating in the umbrella organization. The women's suffrage movement grew in popularity during the Progressive Era, roughly 1890 to 1920. To make it more attractive to middle and upper class white women, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, which finally united the radicals and the middle of the roaders, began to popularize a version of the movement's history that purged it of any controversial issues such as
Racial equality.
Divorce reform,
Working women's rights.
and criticism of organized religion. The contributions of Black and working women were all erased by this process. Susan B. Anthony, who in her younger days was often treated as a dangerous fanatic, was given a grandmotherly image and honored as a suffrage saint. African American women were increasingly marginalized, although the National American Women's Suffrage Association did not exclude them from membership at the national level. State and local organizations could and did choose to exclude them. Conventions held in southern cities like Atlanta in 1895 and New Orleans in 1903 were segregated. So Black women expanded their own organizations and created new ones. In June 1892, the Colored Women's League was founded in Washington, D.C. under their president, Helen Cook. They fought for Black women's suffrage and held night classes. That same year, Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin founded the Women's Era Club, the first Black women's club in Boston and one of the first in the country. Its members devoted their efforts to education, women's suffrage, and race-related issues such as anti-lynching reform. Its slogan was,
help to make the world better.
The Women's Era, the club's illustrated monthly publication, was the first national newspaper published by and for African American women. In 1894, Fannie Barrier Williams tried to join the prestigious Chicago Women's Club, which caused dissension among its members. In 1895, after 14 months, they voted not to exclude anyone based on race. Fannie was finally made a member in 1896. In later years, Williams concentrated on writing and was a reporter for the African American publications Woman's Era, New York Age, and the Chicago Record Herald. In her article in 1900, The Club Movement Among Colored Women of America, she claimed that
Prejudice against African American club women has brought women of the race closer together in their work.
Note, Williams was the only African American chosen to eulogize Susan B. Anthony at the 1907 National American Women's Suffrage Convention.
On July 29, 1895, representatives of 42 black women's clubs from 14 states, including the Colored Women's League of Washington, the Women's Loyal Union of New York, and the Ida B. Wells Club of Chicago, gathered in Boston for the first national conference of the Colored Women of America, with Josephine Ruffin presiding. They convened for 4 days. According to the New York Times, it was
the first movement of the kind ever attempted.
In her opening address, Ruffin explained,
Our women's movement is a woman's movement in that it is led and directed by women for the good of women and men, for the benefit of all humanity, which is more than any one branch or section of it. We act, the active interest of our men, and two, we are not drawing the color line. We are women, American women, as intensely interested in all that pertains to us as such as all other American women.
The National Federation of Afro-American Women was organized during the conference under the leadership of Margaret Murray, Mrs. Booker T. Washington. July 1896, at the first annual convention of the National Federation of Afro-American Women in Washington, D.C., at the urging again of Josephine Ruffin, the organization merged with the Women's Era Club and the Colored Women's League to form the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, whose motto is,
Lifting as we climb, to demonstrate to an ignorant and suspicious world that our aims and interests are identical with those of all good aspiring women.
Harriet Tubman was the keynote speaker, and the new organization advocated for women's rights as well as to uplift and improve the status of African Americans. Mary Church Terrell was the first president, and she told her members,
we have to do more than other women.
On January 30th, 1913, the Alpha Suffrage Club was founded by Ida B. Wells and others in Chicago. It is considered to be the first African American women's suffrage association. The group published the Alpha Suffrage Record as a political voice for the community and developed a highly effective method of canvassing neighborhoods to get out the vote. In June 1913, Illinois women were granted a limited right to vote, and the Alpha Suffrage Club went into high gear to help their members become educated voters. They held classes on the proper use of the ballot and how to use a voting machine.
Fun fact, the group would be instrumental in getting Oscar DePriest elected as the first black alderman in Chicago in 1915, and then to the House of Representatives in 1929.
Women of the theater also strutted their stuff in a series of game-changing marches and parades. They turned their skill at theatrical spectacle into real media savvy, providing unforgettable images that were carried in newspapers across the country. It was a bold tactic, a way of publicizing the cause and combating the idea that women should be relegated to the home. Although many women already moved freely in public, including those who worked outside the home in paid and volunteer positions, the prevailing notion among middle-class circles in the early 1900s was that only women of poor character,
Like prostitutes,
walked the streets. So suffragists steeped their parades in pomp and pageantry, intending to dazzle and attract recruits, grab the attention of legislators,
who found it easy to ignore their petitions,
and dispel notions of suffragists as pathetic spinsters or aggressive shrews who neglected their families and browbeat their husbands. Watching women of all classes parading down public thoroughfares was disturbing to many men and even some women. Carrie Chapman Catt, twice president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, declined to participate in a 1909 parade, saying,
We do not have to win sympathy by parading ourselves like the street cleaning department.
The first American suffrage parades took place in 1908. In February, a small band of 23 women affiliated with a new militant organization, the Progressive Women's Suffrage Union, marched in New York City. The press seemed supportive.
"This first of its kind event will begin in Union Square, then follow Fifth Avenue to Central Park, where, if they can get some cooperation from police and the weather, there will also be speeches in the park at the end of the march. Regardless of the size of the parade, the union's members will be easy to spot because they will be carrying a suffrage yellow banner with
Votes for Women
inscribed on it."
On August 23rd of that year, 300 suffragists in Oakland, California marched into a state political convention holding banners and streamers demanding a suffrage plank on the Republican platform. And on October 29th, 100 women in Boone, Iowa paraded through the streets with suffrage banners welcoming national leader Anna Howard Shaw to their state suffrage convention. The National American Women's Suffrage Association moved to New York in 1909, with President Catt declaring,
New York is the battleground of the whole nation.
the next several parades would prove her right. The first sizable and legal parade in New York City was on May 21st, 1910. Led by the Equality League of Self-Supporting Women and Harriet Stanton Blatch, holding banners such as,
"New York State denies the vote to idiots, lunatics, criminals, and women."
These 400 women, loud, boisterous,
And unaccompanied, oh my.
wearing "Votes for Women" sashes, riding in automobiles or walking, were a game-changing force. On May 6, 1912, Blatch led another parade by the now renamed Women's Political Union, and that attracted 15,000 marchers who owned Fifth Avenue from Washington Square to 57th Street. They challenged the New York State Legislature to put a suffrage referendum on the ballot. Historian Gail Collins explains the spectacle was
The like of which New York never knew before. It was the size and the way it cut across class lines. Corset makers, nurses, social workers, writers, society women, laundresses, teachers, actresses walked arm in arm. Dressmakers carried a banner showing a sewing machine. Writers had pictures of Harriet Beecher Stowe. The advertising industry invented a suffragette clacker and ran "Votes for Women" headlines over the most unlikely copy.
the most important, and the first national march occurred on March 3rd, 1913 in Washington, D.C., the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. The women's suffrage parade led 5,000 marchers in
A spirit of protest
against the present political organization of society from which women were excluded. The assembly included 9 bands, 4 mounted brigades, 3 heralds, and 24 floats. There was tremendous harassment and even physical violence. Cavalry troops from the National Guard were called in to protect the marchers. When the procession ended at the Treasury building, 100 women and children presented an allegorical tableau directed by Hazel McKay and written by the dramatist Glenna Smith Tinnen. The pageant,
Appropriately titled Allegory,
began with the Star-Spangled Banner and the commanding figure of Columbia, dressed in national colors, emerging from the great columns at the top of the Treasury building steps. In the final tableau, Columbia, surrounded by
justice,
Charity,
liberty,
peace, and hope.
all in flowing robes and colorful scarves with trumpets sounding, stood to watch the oncoming procession. The New York Times described the pageant as one of the most impressively beautiful spectacles ever staged in this country.
Fun fact, Hazel McKay was the best known of all pageant directors, creating 4 of them for the National Women's Party between 1913 and 1923. She claimed that nothing surpassed pageants
for the purpose of propaganda.
In a depressing note amid this triumph, and although the marchers were grouped by state, African American women were expected to march together at the back of the procession. Ida B. Wells was having none of it, and she joined the Illinois delegation mid-March. Her white friends closed ranks to protect her, and the image was so powerful that a newspaper photographer singled out this moment for posterity. On October 23rd, 1915, tens of thousands of women flooded Fifth Avenue in a spectacular 5-mile suffrage parade that all but shut down New York City. Tired of being characterized as militants, they were determined to appear demure and motherly in a march that turned out to be
as well choreographed and rehearsed as a Broadway extravaganza.
Henry J. Allen, a Kansas newspaper editor who watched the parade expecting to see a joke, noted,
It was absolutely overwhelming. 40,000 women do not spend days getting ready for a 5-mile march through crowded streets and hours marching in a raw afternoon for a transitory win. It was the most democratic exhibition I have ever seen in New York.
perhaps because of the very dignity and beauty of the event, the parade did not achieve its goal. Just weeks later, the referendum on women's suffrage before the New York State Legislature failed. By 1916, the marches had reached the end of their effectiveness. Activists Alice Paul and Harriet Blatch felt the need for more daring tactics to get the attention of President Wilson, whom Blatch supposedly informed.
I have worked all my life for suffrage, and I am determined that I will never again stand in the street corners of a great city appealing to every Tom, Dick, and Harry for the right of self-government.
Their next move?
Picketing!
Including at the White House.
In the 19th century, speeches and pageants were the most common forms of public address for the cause of women's rights. Even among organized feminists, there was a reluctance to use the political play for serious enlightenment. This might be due to the long tradition of writing on
The women question.
among the bourgeois. The earliest plays written before and after the Civil War were more correctly closet dramas or parlor farces intended for private performances or readings. They were modeled on popular drawing room farces and burlesques, playfully enacting the absurdities envisioned by a reversal of gender roles and the notoriety of the new woman. Plays by Shaw and Ibsen rendered them untouchable by more conservative suffragists. As the profession of acting became more respectable and as actresses achieved fame and financial independence, they were naturally aligned with the suffrage movement, and they were not about to let the powerful tool of drama go to waste. The suffragists from the stage had their most potent weapon in their own trade, at commercial Broadway venues and on the vaudeville circuit, the most popular form of American entertainment from 1881 through the 1920s. Although there were many
New women
written by men and women throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Elizabeth Robins'
Votes for Women
is considered the first suffrage play. It premiered in London in 1907. Robins, an American actress who had emigrated to England, was known as
Ibsen's High Priestess.
Having debuted the role of Hedda Gabler and performed in other Ibsen plays, this influenced her growing feminism and led her to write The Convert, a novel from which Votes for Women was adapted. After its London run, the play toured to Rome and New York and ushered in a wave of suffrage drama. Mary Shaw had been an outspoken and tireless leader in the fight for women's rights since the 1890s. A Broadway actress also known for playing new woman roles by Ibsen and George Bernard Shaw. She starred in Votes for Women when it opened in New York in 1909 as a benefit. It was reported
that suffragettes and suffragists of every shade and degree, from the curbstone militants to the parlor auxiliaries, filled every seat in all available standing room. There were club women in blocks and advanced thinkers in boxes. Everywhere, yellow flowers, ribbons, and buttons. From an upper box gleamed the banner of the American Suffragettes. In the lobby, young women had placards about their necks.
How the Vote Was Won by Cecily Hamilton and Christopher St. John was and remains one of the most popular, well-known suffrage plays. It premiered in London in April 1909, one of the first offerings by the Actresses Franchise League. In 1910, American actress Paula La Follette ended her 10-year Broadway career and offered her talents to the suffrage movement instead. She performed the play numerous times across the U.S. to raise awareness and money for the cause. In 1912, La Follette headlined a week in vaudeville at Hammerstein's Victoria Theater, with the New York Times declaring,
Miss Paula La Follette wins the audience.
Maxine Elliott, a celebrated leading lady and the first woman to have her own Broadway theater, donated it regularly for suffrage benefits, with the first on March 31st, 1909, soon after the theater opened. She also paid for the orchestra. 3 plays were staged for the benefit of the Equality League of Self-Supporting Women: Before the Dawn, A Woman's Influence, and How the Vote Was Won. The matinee was organized by Beatrice Forbes Robertson Hale, Elliott's niece and daughter of the great English actor Sir Johnston Forbes Robertson. Beatrice managed to get her father to speak in favor of suffrage during an intermission. Beatrice Forbes Robertson Hale was also the vice president of the Actresses Franchise League and was a suffragist in England before she relocated to New York City in 1907 to continue her theatrical and political work. In her book,
What Women Want,
she surveyed the state of the American feminist movement in the 1910s.
women have often been taunted with their lack of creative and reasoning faculties. But until the present age, the number of women possessing opportunities to develop these has been so small in proportion to men as to make any comparison invidious. Only now are the faculties of women emerging from obscurity. When as many women as men are free to express themselves, there will remain but one struggle on earth: the struggle of all the dispossessed, men and women alike, for their inheritance.
Ethel Barrymore, practically acting royalty, starred on Broadway in 1911 as a divorcee who spent her savings on a typewriter course which cost her £12 in the 12-Pound Look, written by J.M. Barrie in 1892. Barrie was a supporter of feminism and women's financial independence.
fun fact, J.M. Barrie was also the author of Peter Pan.
Just as the bicycle was considered a freedom machine for the new woman, the typewriter helped to create pink-collar jobs and pave the way for women to become self-supporting. The Gamut Club produced its first feminist theater production in 1912 with a play written by Mary Shaw. The Parrot Cage performed to an overflowing crowd. A raft of new feminist and suffrage plays from the Gamut followed, produced in the club rooms and some even in commercial theaters. Lillian Russell, her legendary voice was heard on the first long-distance telephone service by Alexander Graham Bell on May 8, 1890. Her mother was an ardent feminist and was the first woman to run for New York City mayor. Now, Lillian began writing a newspaper column around 1912 and became vice president of the Gamut Club. A popular lecturer, she drew large crowds and became a wealthy woman. In 1913, she declared that she would refuse to pay her income taxes to protest the denial of the ballot to women.
Sarah Truax made her professional stage debut in 1894 and played leading roles in the major stock companies and regional theaters throughout the country. At the Metropolitan Opera House on May 2nd, and concert performances were extremely popular with white and black audiences. Pauline Hopkins, the first black female playwright whose work we have access to, was an outspoken activist for civil and women's rights. She styled herself the Black Daughter of the Revolution and was an early feminist active in the women's club movement. She represented the Women's Era Club at the annual convention of the New England Federation of Women's Clubs in 1898. In 1901, she was a founding member of the Boston Literary and Historical Association. The Higher Sisters, Anna and Emma, made their professional stage debut as children in 1867. They formed their own touring company and were popular from coast to coast. Together with Hopkins, they were pioneers in black musical theater, and they also set new legal precedents in gaining access to segregated hotels and restaurants. Many of the African American club women were also talented writers and speakers, and it is hard to imagine that they did not have their own propaganda plays and playlets performed in their clubs and associations. Clearly, this is an area for further research.
Support for women's suffrage grew to a national campaign by the early 20th century, but there was still plenty of opposition. Some were the usual suspects, men from all walks, all backgrounds, business leaders and others who believed women's place was in the home. Women's right to vote was opposed by the brewers and distillers, reflecting the close association between suffrage and temperance campaigns. The Southern cotton mills feared women voters would support the drive to eliminate child labor. But many women actively opposed the vote, believing it posed a threat to their domestic supremacy, a condition true mostly for middle and upper class white women. In 1911, associations from different states assembled for an anti-suffrage convention in New York City and formed the National Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage. By 1916, it operated in 25 states with as many as 350,000 members. It also produced the Women's Protest, a newsletter that helped defeat close to 40 women's suffrage referenda. Among the supporters of women's suffrage, these groups and individuals were known as the antis. Cartoons abounded to demean the pro-suffrage advocates.
The suffragists met fire with fire, using humor to combat the ridiculous and often contradictory claims of doom predicted by the antis. Once again, women of the theater played a major role. Shortly after launching heterodoxy, Marie Jenny Howe organized its first public forum at the Metropolitan Temple in New York City at 7th Avenue and 14th Street. Determined that the forum should not be another boring suffrage gathering, Howe limited each of 25 speakers to 5 minutes in which to mop up a trite objection to suffrage. The excitement was heightened by the time limit that Howe rigorously kept to. The more absurd the anti-suffrage argument, the more colorful were the replies. In 1914, Fala LaFollette and Mary Shaw spoke at the second feminist mass meeting at Cooper Union, also chaired by Marie Jenny Howe. An anti-suffrage monologue was written in 1912 and was published an anti-suffrage monologue was written in 1912 and was published in 1913 by the National Woman Suffrage Association, and it is still widely performed today.
Fun fact, the National Women's Suffrage Association became the League of Women Voters.
Please do not think of me as old-fashioned. I pride myself on being a modern, up-to-date woman. I believe in all kinds of broad-mindedness. Only I do not believe in women's suffrage, because to do that would be to deny my sex. Women's suffrage is a reform against nature. Look at these ladies sitting on the platform. Observe their physical inability, their mental disability, their spiritual instability, and general debility. Could they walk up to the ballot box, mark a ballot, and drop it in? Obviously not. Let us grant, for the sake of argument, that they could mark a ballot. But could they drop it in? Huh? No! All nature is against it. The laws of man cry out against it. The voice of God cries out against it, and so do I. Enfranchisement is what makes man, man. Disfranchisement is what makes woman, woman. If women were enfranchised, every man would be just like every other woman, and every woman would be just like every man. There would be no difference between them. And don't you think that would rob life of just a little of its poetry and romance? I know you begin to see how strongly I feel on this subject, but I have some reasons as well. These reasons are based on logic. Of course, I am not logical. I am a creature of impulse, instinct, intuition, and I glory in it. But I know that these reasons are based on logic because I have culled them from the men whom it is my privilege to know. My first argument against suffrage is that women would not use it if they had it. That you couldn't drive them to the polls. My second argument is if the women were enfranchised, they would neglect their homes, desert their families, and spend all their time at the polls. I have arranged these arguments in couplets. They go together in such a way that if you don't like one, you can take the other. This is my third anti-suffrage couplet. If the women were enfranchised, they would vote exactly as their husbands do and only double the existing vote. Do you like that argument? Huh? Well, if not, take this one. If the women were enfranchised, they would vote against their own husbands, thus creating dissension, family quarrels, and divorce. Fourth anti-suffrage couplet. Women cannot understand politics, therefore there would be no use in giving women political power, because they would not know what to do with it. On the other hand, if the women were enfranchised, they would rapidly mount into power, take all of the offices from all the men, and soon we would have women governors of all our states and dozens of women acting as president of the United States. I have talked to many women suffragists, and I find them unreasonable. I say to them, here I am, convince me. I ask for proof. Then they proceed to tell me of Australia and Colorado and other places where women have passed excellent laws to improve the condition of working women and children. But I say, what of it? These are facts. I don't care about facts. I ask for proof. Then they quote the 8 million women of the United States who are now supporting themselves, and the 25,000 married women in the city of New York who are self-supporting. But I say again, what of it? These are statistics. I don't believe in statistics. Facts and statistics are things which no truly womanly woman would ever use. The great trouble with the suffragists is this. They interfere too much. They always interfere. Let me take a practical example. There is, in the city of New York, a nurses' settlement where 60 trained nurses go forth to care for sick babies and give them pure milk. Last summer, only 2 or 3 babies died in the slum district around the nurses' settlement, whereas formerly hundreds of babies have died there every summer. Now what are these women doing? Interfering with the death rate. And what is their motive in doing so? They seek notoriety. They want to be noticed. They are trying to show off. And if 60 women who merely believe in suffrage behave in this way, what may we expect when all women are enfranchised? What ought these women to do with their lives? Each one ought to be devoting herself to the comfort of some man. You may say, they are not married. But I answer, let them try a little harder that they might find some kind of man to devote themselves to. What does the Bible say on this subject? It says, seek and ye shall find. Besides, when I look around me at the men, I feel that God never meant us women to be too particular. Let us consider for a moment the effect of women's enfranchisement on man. I think someone ought to consider the men. What makes husbands faithful and loving? The ballot and the monopoly of that privilege. If women vote, what will become of men? They will all slink off drunk and disorderly. It comes down to this. Someone must wash the dishes. Now, would you expect man made in the image of God, to roll up his sleeves and wash the dishes? Why, it would be blasphemy. I know that I am but a rib, and so I wash the dishes. Or I hire another rib to do it for me, which amounts to the same thing.
All of the theater women we've mentioned today are inspiring examples of artists using their elevated positions to fight for progressive change. Some of the names you have heard are well known to theater and suffrage historians. Others are barely mentioned, and some are left out of the narrative entirely.
Like Fala La Follette.
Most of these women are invisible to the larger community, and the ones we've highlighted are just the tip of the iceberg. There were thousands of voices raised all over the United States and in other countries as well, demanding votes for women. And when suffrage was achieved, they immediately moved on to fight for the Equal Rights Amendment, first introduced to Congress in 1921. E-R-A! 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 It has never been ratified. We are once again hearing our sister artists confront the entrenched power brokers at the highest level of government and within our own industry, as disturbing stories of sexual abuse are publicly coming to light. It is the power of women's voices from all walks of life, raised both singularly and even more powerfully together, that conducts the vibrant symphony of change. Just as our foremothers were ultimately successful in winning the vote after almost a century of struggle, perhaps yet another century later, all women will hold the real benefits of the ballot. Wouldn't it be wonderful to imagine that 100 years hence, our descendants are not still fighting the same battle? But in order for that dream to become reality, we must listen to this warning from Susan B. Anthony, who was unfortunately too prescient back in 1894.
We shall someday be heated, and when we shall have our amendment to the Constitution of the United States, everybody will think it was always so. Just exactly as many young people think that all the privileges, all the freedom, all the enjoyments which woman now possesses always were hers.
They have no idea
of how every single inch of ground that she stands upon today has been gained by the hard work of some little handful of
women of the past.